Okay, good morning. So the big question that people ask time and again, and I was asked to speak about this week, so I will, is bchira chofshis, free will. Do we have free will? So yes, there's the humorous response by the cynics that say we must believe in free will, we have no choice. So try to wrap your head around that. But the obvious question that everyone asks is, if God knows everything, Yediyah and Bechira, He knows everything beforehand, so how could we, so whatever choice we made was already known beforehand. But you go deeper, there are other questions as well. Especially our Chassidus that we discussed last week, that Isavus is B'chol Rega Mamish, that if the Eibishter wants to stop creating the world, He doesn't have to do anything. So every second is completely sustained by Elokus. You know the famous difference between how a Chassid answers the question, if the Eibishter wanted to destroy the world and a Misnagid, or a Nit Chassid. So Aish Halacha will answer, let's look in the Torah. The Eibishter will bring a mabel, then he'll bring a fire. And Al Pi Halacha, when you mevayir something, biur, you burn it. It's like considered Eis Metzias. And the whole effort to destroy the world. And a Chassid answers very simple. The Eibishter wanted not to have a world, he doesn't have to do anything. He just stops speaking. He stops willing, and everything just ceases to be. So based on that, where's the Bechal room for Bechira? The very hand, Ch'mon al-Tzlan, that will lift itself to do something, God forbid, bad, is being sustained that very second by the Eibishter, every second. You couldn't do a thing without that Elokus. And at the same time, you're saying that when it comes to Bechira, you have the choice, real choice, and not illusion. Because if Bechira is an illusion, using the Rambam's words, that Bechira is a Yesod, Chazak, absolute foundation in all of Yiddishkeit, because without that, there's no responsibility and no accountability and no schar and einish. There's no, how could you obligate someone who doesn't have choice? For example, a predator in the wild, a tiger goes hunting and kills a prey, you're not going to prosecute the tiger and say, hey, you killed an animal, because it doesn't have choice. That's the way it was wired, that's the way it was created, and it actually has a purpose even. But human being, no, there's a whole laws and halachas that's expected, adamud le'elam, even b'shas hashina, even when we're asleep. So we clearly know that Bechira is not an illusion. I'm just negating all the different possible arguments. It's real. And yet at the same time, it's not just Yediyas Hashem, it's also Yisavus, is B'chol Rega in every second. Another obvious question is the famous, we know, Le'yidach memenu nidach. The Rambam Paskins, B'seif Yisrael Eisen Shuva, B'seif Galusin Yisrael Eisen Shuva, Miyad Hein Negolim. As a halacha, haftocha. So that's Bechira. So what's the Bechira exactly? The end, Le'yidach memenu nidach. We say, and Hayem Yem brings from the Alter Rebbe, Ayid Nishta Vil, Nishta Ken Zayn Obgerissen von Elokus. He can't. Nishta Vil, he doesn't want to, and Nishta Ken, he can't. That seems to be a direct stira to Bechira, so then he doesn't have choice. Yeah, he may have choice whether he's, it could be today or tomorrow, or it's Begoli or Behelim. But the Etzem Ha'inyan, the Etzem HaNefesh, we say, Yisrael v'Kudsha B'rich Kul Echad, and the Etzem HaNefesh is connected to the Eibishter, and that we have no choice over that. And all the expressions that we use, Maminim B'nei Maminim, Mafal Pishachat Yisrael, etc., etc. So Bechira is not a simple matter. So to address this properly, even though there are many different places, there are letters from the Rebbe, there's the Meforshim and Pirkei Avos on the Mishnah that says, the Mishnah itself says both elements. Hakol Tzafei, Hakol, the Eibishter knows everything, V'Reshus Nesuna. So the Eibishter knows everything, and then the next phrase says that Reshus is given. How do you reconcile? The Mishnah itself is bringing both together. So right there in Medrash Shmuel, and another Mefarshei Pirkei Avos, they talk barichas about it. Some of these commentaries are brought in Chassidus, in the Rebbe's letters, which I'll quote soon. So it's not a topic that began with Chassidus. It's a topic that goes back from the beginning of time. And of course, the Rambam himself addresses it, and the Ravid has a Hagos HaRavid rather, on the Rambam. So it's a topic that is everywhere. And yet, you see, time and again, everybody asks the question. Can't tell you how many times I hear the question again and again, even from people who are scholars and so on. For some reason, we can't wrap our head exactly around it. So I'll try to do is gather together everything, not everything mamish, but at least b'chlolos, what has been written about it, and put it also in an organized way, and also explain why it's so hard to wrap our head around it. And the first reason why it's so hard is because the example I gave. We are so accustomed to a world where everything is cause and effect. There's nothing in this world that has really free will. It doesn't exist. God forbid you put your hand in fire, it's going to get burned. You throw up an object, it's going to fall to the ground. These are rules, these are like deterministic, what we call laws of deterministic rules of nature that are built into the system. And from a Torah point of view, the Eibishter built it in. That's why it says, Kosher Kikriyas Yamsuf, Kosher Zivugim Kikriyas Yamsuf. Why is it hard for the Eibishter to Kriyas Yamsuf? He created the Yam, he created Yabosha, what's the big thing? Because the Eibishter himself bound himself to the laws of nature. He said, Lo Yushbeisu, after the Mabul, when there was the Hefsek, the Mazolis for that year stopped. Lo Shimsha Mazolis, the Eibishter said, Lo Yushbeisu, that he won't do such a thing again. And even when the Eibishter makes a miracle, even Kriyas Yamsuf, you see, it's not complete suspension of nature. It came out, Ruach, there's a strong wind that makes the water go up as walls. The Eibishter could have just made a path. More than that, he could have just made the water disappear. He could have just made them walk on water. There's so many ways that it could have happened. So even the Nes, and we don't call it Nes Melubish B'Teva, and yet still the Eibishter didn't completely destroy Teva. So whatever reason, the Eibishter himself bound himself to a world of rules and cause and effect. So the very concept of Bechira goes against the grain of everything we know. So suddenly there comes an area where there's real free will. Everything is deterministic. Just to bring a secular a point, there was a philosopher, a French philosopher, his name was Laplace. In the 19th century, he wrote and said that if we can get all the data on a human being or on anything in this world, we can predict everything that will happen till the end of time. The only problem is this head of Yediyah. We don't have the data. In other words, if we can figure out your DNA, and everything that you're wired, and put it into, let's say, a computer, it can tell you exactly what you're going to do the rest of your life. Not predict the future, just understand cause and effect, because, like I said, there are, and of course when he said it, you can imagine the religious world got very upset, because essentially said that there's no such thing as Bechira. The only reason we have choice is because we don't know. But if you knew every detail, you could predict everything a person will do. Now it's interesting, in the 20th century came along in science the concept of, in quantum mechanics, I'm not giving a science lesson here, but just to mention, the Rebbe brings it in some places, the Heisenberg's called uncertainty principle, that actually on a subatomic level, there are things that are not deterministic, not because we don't know, but the etzem, it's probable it can go this way, it can go that way. As a matter of fact, the Rebbe even wrote once on a sikha that I prepared, I remember, first Fabrengen I ever wrote, Hanoche, Shabbos Pasha Mikes Tov Shin Mem. So the Rebbe spoke there about the Chalemus, the pasuk in Vayeshev, V'Ovav Shomeres Hadovar, that when Yosef told his Chalemus to his brothers, so, and they of course got all upset, Vayikanu Be'echov, because the two Chalemus were all about how they're going to bow to him, and he'll be the Melech. And it says, Yaakov, Ovav Shomeres Hadovar. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? There's a lot of meaning. What means Ovav Shomeres Hadovar? So it says, Hakel Helech Achar HaPisr, that Yaakov didn't say anything because he knew if you don't interpret the dream, Ilavdavka is going to happen that way. It means Hakel Helech Achar HaPisr. When you interpret it, you actually make it a reality. So Yaakov withheld Shomeres Hadovar, he was quiet. That's what the Gemara says. So the Rebbe explained, what does that mean? It's a cholam emes. For false cholam, it's tam dvarim b'teilim, it's one thing. But if it's a true cholam, it's going to be fulfilled. And we saw what's fulfilled. That they did it. He was a Mishnah Melech, etc. And the Rebbe explains, because there is a state, the cholam is a state which not yet been defined. And the Pisan HaCholim can actually make it happen. And the Rebbe said, the Dugme, where it says in Samach Vov, that Lifnei Tzimtzum, there's Sfiras Ein Ketz, which means it can go many ways. It's Ein Ketz. We don't know which Sfiras. It's not just 10 Sfiras. And then the Eibishter chose that it should be Dafka these Esther Sfiras. So you see there's a matzav where it's still like Yechelis Ha'atzmus. So the Rebbe showed that there's a darga, in other words, that it's not yet defined. And interestingly, that is essentially in quantum mechanics, there's a concept that things are not defined. So Laplace was wrong. Even if you have all the data, there's certain things you cannot determine. They're determined afterwards by the interpreter, by the observer, and so on. I don't want to go much more into that. Just wanted to bring it out because it's a question that people ask. You ask scientists, they'll say, no, there's no free will. But a lion has free will, a tiger has free will, a fire has free will, nothing has free will. This is I believe, one of the reasons why it's hard to really fully understand. That's why it's critical, and I'll begin with the famous Rambam. The Alter Rebbe brings in Likutei Torah Emer, on the pasuk Hein Hoya Adam Ka'achad Mimenu. So they to basically say Hoya Adam Ka'achad Mimenu. What's the Ka'achad Mimenu? The Eibishter says the human being is like us, meaning like himself, like the Eibishter. So he says that's Bechira, that the Eibishter gave a divine gift, basically, something only the Eibishter has. Because like I said, everything in this world has a Sibah and Mesubav, Ilah v'Ol, cause and effect. The only thing that doesn't is the Lashon of Ageres HaKedesh, Simechav, Mitzyusim Asmuseh. Only the Eibishter doesn't have any Teva, Kavyachol, any so-called nature that you can predict and say he's going to do this. He's going to predict nothing. The Eibishter is not bound by anything. This world is bound by rules. It was created with rules. So it has to follow those rules. The Eibishter is the creator of the rules. So he's not bound by any rules. So he's the only one that has true Mitzyusim Atzmusi, the only thing that doesn't have a Sibav Ilah, Shekad Melech Chaz V'Sholem. So B'Mela, total B'chira. Whatever he wants, he does. Kol Yachol. He could choose. Once he chooses, he can bind himself to that. And maybe we'll talk about it later. Chassidus says that once the Eibishter is Boicher, then it's a mitis hischayvus, because he didn't have to. So when he chooses, it's absolutely that way. It's not like optional. By us, we choose because we don't have a choice, so to speak. So the Eibishter gave us a piece of godliness, something that only the Eibishter has. And that itself is already a big chiddush. That means that we have something that is against goes. You have to eat. Now, pi halacha, you can't live without eating for 7 days. You can't go without drinking for 3 days. That's why it says aneder. Someone says I won't drink, or it's a neder shav. It's meaningless because it's not possible. So there are things that we have not. You can jump up 10 feet, 5 feet. You can't jump up 100 feet. It's not possible. Even as much as a person exercises, there are absolute hagbolas. But the Eibishter said, I will give you one thing, a piece of myself, so to speak. Just like Al Derech, I would say chelik elikam al mamish, but Al Derech gives something that's elikus, that is giving us something that's not human. More than not human, it's not natural. So that's the first thing that I just want to state for the record, which is perhaps why it's so hard to wrap our heads around it, because we don't have any examples for it. Because there's nothing else in existence that has that type of b'chira dike chavshis or b'chira mitis that comes from elikus. Everything in this world, as I said, cause and effect. Nothing has choice. Everything's like a clock. The sun rises in the morning, you can predict exactly when it's going to rise, and everything is all figured out. But nevertheless, that would be, if you stopped right here, it would be like, okay, the Eibishter is called Yachol, so you can give a human being a power to do something, that free will. But we still have to answer a lot of questions. So let's go more deeper into this, and especially because the Eibishter himself wanted us to understand it as much as possible. So the way I'll break it down is in the structure of Chassidus itself. So we know that the relationship between Elikus and Welt is in 3 ways: Amal Kalam, Sevav Kalam, and Atzmus. For example, in Tanya Peri Gimel, Alter Rebbe, when he speaks about right away there in the beginning, the Hisbonenus, that brings to Ava V'yira, so he says, Mizbeinin and what? Amal Kalam, Sevav Kalam, Ukula Kamei Kaloch Hashem. 3 things. The Rebbe, I think, once wrote or said that Samach Vov is geboit on the 3 klolim: Mamala, Sevav, Asmus. And you see in many letters of the Rebbe, many biyurim, the Rebbe sums things up in these 3 ways. So I believe we can also apply all the biurim in Bechira that I've seen go into the category, either you're talking mitzad Mamala Klalman or Seva Klalman mitzad Atzmus. And each one has a different biur in how you explain Bechira and reconcile Bechira and Yediyah, or Bechira and Ashgacha, or Bechira and, like I said before, Etzem. And when you conflate these, you mix them up, it gets very confusing because they're not the same answers. So I'm going to go through step by step, starting the discussion of Bechira and Yediyah in Mamal Klalman, and then in Sevav Klalman, and then in Atzmus. So, just to give a little few Maramekemis, you can look in the Isofis, Chelik Zayin, Likutei Sichos, in the back in Bechukesai, where the Rebbe talks. There's a few powerful letters about it. There's obviously the Sicha, the is it Vayakel Menvov that I mentioned last week, the Hadran and the Rambam, the Rebbe brings there in some of the notes. And there's more places where the Rebbe discusses it. There's a Sichos Chelik Yud Ches, where he talks about, was it the Sicha of, is it Shlach or Keirach, I believe, maybe Keirach, and there's some more. But so here's the first step of understanding this issue. Let's know the Yediyah. We said about Yediyah. The Eibishter knows what's going to be. So everything you're going to do today, l'teiv l'mutav, is already known. Hakol Yedua, Hakol Sofei. That's the basic concept that the Eibishter can know everything because he's not bound by the Gidrei Azman, Ovar, Heva, and Osid. So if he knows what's going to happen, everyone had to ask, how could we choose? So the answer to that actually is the simplest one. Because what does that mean that he knows? Because someone knows something doesn't mean it affects you? Not necessarily. So the Rebbe brings, this is the famous Hasoga of the Ravid on the Rambam. The Ravid says, what kind of question? When the Rambam asks, how is it possible, Bechira and Yediyah? So the Ravid says, we see it all the time. The concept of a stargazer, someone that sees the future. Yedei Asidus, like a Novi. So a Novi knows what's going to happen. And we don't say the Novi affects what's going to happen. He knows. It's like someone from the outside, just like some people know things afterwards. So now you know it after the fact, you know it before the fact. As long as you don't tell the person who's choosing, and you don't hold their hand, meaning affect them, the Yediyah, so to speak, is outside of the person and doesn't affect them. Yediyah itself, in other words, doesn't affect choice. And the Rebbe brings from Medrash Shmuel, so the Meir Ameshlani, I think is the name, or Ameshlagi, explains it at length. This answer, that Yediyah is not a stira to Bechira, because Yediyah does not affect the Yediyah, the Yodua, the thing that is known. And the Ravid says it befedish. Okay, so that's a very basic answer about Yediyah and Bechira. The problem is, of course, that that's a good answer on the level of Mamala Kalam. Because Mamala Kalam is Taka, Chassidus says the difference in Yodua and Yediyah. So Mamala is the Eibishter Lelukus is mislabish in Welt, even in Gidrei Hazman Amokim. So even though the Eibishter obviously knows beforehand what's going to be, but he does not affect the existence. The problem is, as the Rebbe writes in one letter, he says that that's by us is the fact. The Rebbe gives another example. I should give another example before I continue. I give the example of Yedei Asidus. The Rebbe says another example would be, you know someone well. You know that tomorrow, if something happens so-and-so, you know how they're going to react. Because you know them. Does that mean your Yediyah is affecting how they're going to react? Or the way they react is affecting your Yediyah? You just happen to know that person. I don't know the person, so I can't predict how he's going to behave. Let's say, but very often we plan something, you have to tell somebody something that you know is going to shock them. So pretty much you can know some people get shocked, some people are this a reaction. That's when you know them. So it's because your Yediyah doesn't affect their reaction, as their reaction affects your Yediyah. It happens to be that you know that person well beforehand. The Rebbe brings these examples to explain how Yediyah does not affect Bechira. On the contrary, the Eibishter, so to speak, is like has a bird's eye view. It's like let's say you're walking down a road. So you don't know what's coming up in the road. But imagine someone standing on a mountain and they see the road ahead of you and they see that there's they see there's a hole. So and then you walk and you God forbid you fall into the hole. So you're going to say because they knew there's a hole, that's why you fell? No. They happened to be watching from the outside. Didn't affect you. If they don't say anything, then what happens is they just were able to see beforehand what would happen. So it's not like affecting. But that's all predicated on Yediyah as we know it. I know what you may do, or I can predict what you're going to do. Doesn't mean my Yediyah affects you. But Yediyah Salakul, Yediyah by the Eibishter, is Mahava. The Eibishter is not just a Yediyah. He doesn't know, he also creates. In other words, so we have to answer, how do we do with that? Yes, if the Eibishter was just a detached, so-called observer, it's one thing. But the Eibishter is, like we said before, Mahava, Machayim, Mekayim, and the idea of the Eibishter is Mahava, not just from the outside. So we need a second level of explanation. So the Rebbe says, again, he's quoting other sources, but this would be now the Biur on Seviv Kolam. So we have to understand Seviv. In the Lashon of the Rambam, even though the Rambam doesn't use language of Chassidus, what is the Rambam's answer? The Hasogas HaRavid is on the Rambam, which also will explain what did the Rambam mean. Well, the Ravid seems to have a very klotz kasha. That the Rambam says, the Rambam answers, Lo yidiyase ki yidiyasenu. We don't know how the Eibishter knows things. Hu amada, hu yidei, hu yidua. So since it's a mystery how the Eibishter knows, he could know something and it doesn't affect us. So of course, why doesn't he just answer like the Ravid answers? Because the Ravid is speaking mitzvah mamala kalam. Mamala kalam, you could answer that. That's so-called, the Yediyas Alakus is outside of the Nivre, Kavyochel. But from Pchin of Seviv Kalam, which is Mahava, you can't answer that. So now you have to answer that the Eibishter has a way of knowing something, Be'efem Makif. That's called Seviv. What means Be'efem Makif? That he could be there, and at the same time not affect. Like the Rebbe brings in some places that, that's why you find at times you say the Eibishter knew something, but he didn't say it. If the Eibishter had said it b'dibur, that would change the whole picture, because then he would affect the situation. But just a Yediyah could be b'chinas Makif, and we know a Makif does not have to affect something. How? It's a mystery. That's what the Rambam says, Le yidiyase ki yidiyasenu. So the answer in this case is that in some mysterious way the Eibishter is able to suspend that his Yediyah, though it's Mahava, doesn't affect our choice. So essentially it's an answer that is an answer that makes sense, but it's not like we understand it, we just understand the Eibishter can do that, and that's what he does. So those are the first two level answers that you see in many places when it comes to this thing. Either, as I said, the idea doesn't affect, or even if it does affect, the Eibishter can make it in a way that he shouldn't affect it, and therefore the person has total bechira. So those are like the first two level answers. But the problem, of course, is the biggest one is Mitzad Etzem. This is all good Mitzad Giluyim. Mamala, Seviv, but Atzmus is B'chlal not shaykh to all these things. As I said before, the way a person was created, A'id, Nishta vil Nishta ken zayin agedis von Elikus. So what do you do with that? So here is 2 points that need to be made. And this gets a little more complicated, obviously. Again, we don't want to just rely on Kol Yochel. Because Kol Yochel, then you could just say Kol Yochel and that's it. We want to try to understand it as much as possible. So there's 2 key points to remember here. Remember a few weeks ago, I read the Rishima from the Rebbe connected to Yud Gimel Ir, the Rebbe's brother's yahrzeit. So the Rebbe brings there, is there a Chelik Lamed Gimel here? I just want to read the actual Lashon, because it's very helpful here to understand. Chelik Lamed, look at this, Lamed Gimel? I think it's Lamed Gimel, right? Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's Chav Zayin. Just one second. Yeah, go ahead, sure. Maybe it's Chav Zayin. Let me check, maybe Chav Zayin. Go ahead, yeah. Please.
The Indian was gesagt as Yediyase is
My mistake. 1 second. First of all, a minute. It's not Sefer Bamidbar. It's either Chavov. No, it's not Chavov. It's Chav Zayin. So I think it's Chilek Chav Zayin, right? That's where the Rishim is? Yeah. Chav Zayin. I said Lamed Gimel, I meant Lamed Beis. Okay, sorry, fine. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Die Idee vermutlich der ganzen Hälfte mit seinem Atmos. Das Leben, Mechaya mit der Bechira, weil wir das gucken auf dem Ebersten, der ist schon gewähnt dort und noch getan.
Okay, al derech was ich gesagt. Al derech was ich gesagt wegen Yediyah.
No, aber das nicht mit sagen, mit Maler und Seder. Weil wird es jetzt schon gewähnt. Wird es, wenn wir sagen, man kann sich vorstellen, als ein Mensch ist dort und darf nicht folgen. Man kann es nicht verstehen, dass sagt. Mit seinem Atmes ist vor allem ein Messias, wo sein Messias
aber wie ich verstehe von dem Merkte, das ist Abir mit Saad Mamala, oder mit Saad Sevev. Für was nicht?
Für was hast du mit Mamala und Sevev?
Weil Sevev ist Lamaila mit Mann. Und Mele kann sein früher, was ist sein später?
Von Sevev, was hat, ob es ein Scheich zu der. Da ist mit Sadat wird man ganz dicken Scheich nicht. Weil es von einer Messias, was ist echt von alles,
es klar steht klar in dem Brief von dem, der Bier, was du sagst, mit Samen Mala füllen, oder Sevev füllen. Atmos ist eine ganz andere Sache. Aber wer sagt, hat mit Atmos, das mit Saad. Aber
ja, Mensch,
ist nicht da, jetzt kann ich nicht Dinge mit ihm. Ich kann sich nicht Dinge mit ihm, aber ich wollte gesagt, als er...
Ich das Madrigen, was nicht mit dem Madrigen.
Die Deiti kann man das Masber sein mit Saad Sevev sehr leicht. Und dafür stand kommen zu Atmos, weil Sevev ist echt mal mit Masber. Viele Mamalle. Ich habe gesagt, a person standing on a mountain and he sees what's going to be. He sees it before it happened, because he sees it like from Lamayla. But okay.
No, he sees that it happened already.
Okay, so in other words, he sees now what will be afterwards. Okay. So what I wanted to say was, the first point regarding the big issue of Bechira, so the Rebbe writes like this here, which is interesting. He speaks about Bechira, and he says like this. Remember, I just repeat what we learned then. He said, because the Eber's Kavon El Yena is that there should be the Yeridis Nishtalshus Mamay Lamato. V'Kavon Sheti Acher Kach Aliyah Acher Aliyah V'Kiv Shekenu HaKavon El Yena Ari Nasa came Bepeil. Ke'ein Ma'akev Chaz V'Shalom. So then the question is, what about Bechira? So the Rebbe says like this, these words. Ubchiras Adam Keves Mehiras Ha'aliyah. That's what the Rebbe answers. That the Bchiras Adam affects how fast it's going to happen. That the Aliyah is going to happen, like Lo Yidach Memenu Nidach, that everyone will have an Aliyah at the end, like Save Galuson, Yisrael Eisen Shuva, Miyad Hein Negolin. It's for sure going to happen. But Bechira is the issue is Mehiras Ha'aliyah. Okay. And Ve'efen Haliyah. In other words, for example, if a person, God forbid, sins, so the Efen Aliyah is going to be through tshuva. A tzaddik, the Efen Aliyah would not be through tshuva. That's what the Rebbe brings here. So basically he says, B'chol zeh nenash ha-beicher, kivin shalei zu kavanoseh shalei. So the beicher is nenash because that was not his kavanah. But the bottom line is, everybody is going to have the Aliyah, and the Bechira is only in how fast, and the manner, how it's going to get there. So in other words, if Adam and Chava, for example, did not sin, and that their Bechira would have been, and Mashiach would have come. They did. Mashiach is still going to come, but now it's going to take Chmon al-Islam, more years, more time. That's how the Rebbe explains it here. But that still leaves, the Rebbe doesn't answer the Shaila Bechira, he's just saying that's how he explains Bechira. But this question still means, so what does that mean? That we don't really have etzem Bechira. We have only Bechira, how fast it's going to happen. So we have to explain a little more what this is.
What's that to say that we have Bechira etzem? At what point do we not satisfied?
What's not satisfied really is that the idea, let's say the Rambam says that it's a yesod in schar neinish. So when a person chooses right now, you're saying the only thing that's really affecting, it's not like you really have choice. You're ultimately going to choose good. You just didn't choose it right now. But tomorrow, at the end of the story, you will choose. It just makes the Bechira sound like a lot less significant. Can you say that? You could. But you'll see, I'm going to explain it in a deeper way now. Because here comes the big question. The Rebbe brings in some places that Bechira means that you have to have two things that are equal paths. Because if not, it's not Bechira. He brings from Tanya. That why Laman Nidma Gufei Yisrael Ke Gufei Umas Elam, that's why you could say Vana Vacharta. Because if one thing is apples and one thing is oranges and you want apples, there's no Bechira. So you need the apples to both categories be apples, and you choose which apple you want. The Rebbe brings this example in a number of places. Now, based on that, the question, as I said, but in this case we're talking about here that at the end of the day, that a Eid will always choose an Elokus. The Rambam Paskins even in Hilchos Gerushin, that's why it's the union of Kfiyah, where Kefanesi Achem Eretzani. How could you be Kefa? It's a get Musa. And the Rambam says, because that's what he really wants. It's the Yitzrei Hu She'onse. That's what the Eid really wants. So is it just a matter of choice as, okay, two things look equal? It's a lot deeper than that. So therefore, you have to go back to understand the bigger issue here. Why Taka does the Eibishter, the only one I mentioned in the beginning, that the only one you could really say Bechira Amitis is by the Eibishter? Why is that the case? So the Pashtusdik reason is because the Eibishter is not defined by anything. We were created that we need to eat. So that said, there's no choice about that. You can do nothing about it. If you want to live, you have to eat. The same other things that we have, that are nature, we have to breathe. By the Eibishter, you can't say any of that because he's the Beta, and he created all these rules. So there's no rule you can say that applies to the Eibishter. That's the Lashon where the Rashba brings. If there's Nimnoyes, if Imlin is Nimnoyes Yesh Teva Kayam, is there something that's not possible, that the Eibishter is limited by? And the answer is no, Nimna Nimnoyes. That's what Nimna Nimnoyes means. That the Nimnoyes, which would be some obstacle, he's Nimna. There's an obstacle to the obstacle. It's an interesting twist of words. But basically, nothing is not possible. Basically, but only by the Eibishter. Because the Eibishter doesn't have a tchuna or teva or any shape or form or definition. Completely not. And every definition that exists, and the Adarab, the Eibishter created. He could choose to bind himself to it and say, I will follow those rules too. They are his rules. But when we say, for example, Kishem sheyesh lekeche bebilti bal gvul, kach yesh lekeche begvul, the Chassidus brings from the Vedas HaKedesh, what are we saying? Not the Eibishter became gvul chaz v'sholom. It's a kayach. There's no limit. He can create bli gvul, he can create gvul. Bli gvul is also a creation. To say the Eibishter is only bli gvul is not necessarily a maila. It's a maila compared to a gvul. But the Eibishter that's beyond bli gvul, so bli gvul is like a mashmala. So he could also create gvul. And when he does, that's also part of his yichelis. Yichelis to create gvul is not weaker than yichelis to create bli gvul. So basically, that's the basic reason why everything, therefore, is pure choice. You know, could he have chosen not to have a nesava? So the answer, of course, is, of course he could have chosen. But that's what nesava means. That's he desires to have dir b'tachtein. So it's, in other words, higher than all these concepts of hechrich, or tam sichli, or reasons, or all the logic that we apply to everything that is not applicable by the Eibishter. But what does that really mean? So then we say, so then when he chooses, what happens? And let's say when he chooses, it says, once the Eibishter chose, that's what he chose. So now, is he bound once he chooses or not? And this is the interesting thing, and this is the critical thing. So the Eibishter then suddenly, what happened? Did he move from a state where he was completely detached, so to speak, and not defined, and now he's chosen, and now so-called he's stuck? Kavyachla can move on. Now that he said, in other words, can it be possible that the Eibishter should not choose Am Yisrael? So in Teirah Shalom, the Rebbe Rashab says, it's not shayach that he should choose, he says, Vem is Ola Kleiben? Ivan? That's what he says. There's a sikha there, put it. So that seems to be a steer to the whole thing. Of course he could have chosen whatever he wanted. But we understand, could he have chosen? Can he choose something else? Can he choose, there shouldn't be Teirah mitzvahs? So Chassidus says the language is it's a rotzen atzmi. Teirah mitzvahs is not just a choice, optional. It's a rotzen atzmi. Mitzvahs misyachsas ala atzmos. But how do you reconcile that? On one hand, you say the Eibishter is completely not bound by anything. Anything. Not even Teirah mitzvahs, not even Yisrael, nothing. And then at the same time you say it's a rotzen atzmi. Misyachsas ala atzmos. In other words, there are things in this world that can change. He rotzen, the Eibishter could, for example, a person that could be a gzeira, the person is not well, and then he gets a refuah shleima. The Eibishter change, so to speak, his position. I'm not talking about in etzem. And also, when we say Ani Hashem Leisha Nisi, also seems to imply that the way it is the way it is, and it can be changed. So here's where Chassidus introduces this concept, which is a very subtle concept. I'll try to explain it the short time we have. The concept that Atzmos is not nitfas in his choices. That's a critical piece here. What does that mean? When we make a choice, even if it's Bechira Chavshis, you're nitfas in your choice. If you decide right now, you commit to something, unless you change your mind, you're now committed to it. And you're nitfas, you're defined by it. There's rules and you're defined by it, and you have to get involved in it and so on. If you didn't choose, you didn't choose. But the Eibishter could be that even when he chooses, he's not defined by what he chooses. He always remains not nitfas. Not nitfas doesn't mean he doesn't care. It means that he's not defined by it. We are defined by things because we live in a world of definitions. So basically what real bechira means, not just you can choose between two options. It means what you choose is not imposed on you. When we choose to eat, or whatever, we're not really choosing because we have to eat. So now you're fulfilling what you have to do. Because the Eibishter doesn't have to do it, so when he does it, he's not defined by it. So in other words, the real bechira amitis in etzem is not mitzad that he could choose. Could the Eibishter choose evil? We say no. It's not shaykh the Eibishter should choose evil. Not because he's teva hatev only, because the Eibishter doesn't have a nature. It's because when the Eibishter chooses something, he's not nitfus in it. The concept of evil is something the Eibishter b'chal not shaykh to the Eibishter. So even when he chooses tev, he's not nitfus, he's not defined by it, which is different than everything else in existence. So what Chassidus is saying is that when the etzem of Eid is connected to the etzem of the Eibishter, and that lo yidach memenu nidach, and ultimately will do tshuva, what is bechira there? Bechira really means that you're choosing who you really are. And you can't change that. You can't change the fact that that the etzem of Eid is bound, like we said before, is bound, nishta vil, nishta ken zayin, abgerisim felakus. But the question is, why are you choosing? Are you choosing because you were brought up like that? Or because it's cultural? Or because it makes sense? Or you're choosing because that's your etzem? And when the etzem chooses something, it's not nitfis by it. It's who you are. It's not imposed. So to put it in very blunter terms, you could argue that most people that are ashamed to take the mitzvahs today are doing so because they grew up with it. They didn't really choose it. Who chose it? Most of us. Talk about Baal Tshuva in a moment. But who chose it? You grew up in a home, from your youngest age, impressionable age, you were taught to do everything. And that's where you are. You could choose to leave, but it's not so easy. You've been programmed. Can you say it's really total bechira? And you're absolutely nitfis in it, because that's what defines you. And lahavdil, Rahman al-Islam, if you grew up in a different type of home, you'd be nitfis in that style, whatever that culture was. Comes to Baal Tshuva, we could argue about it. You could also say Baal Tshuva also has a pniyah. His life was not working. He sees the appeal of Yiddishkeit. In other words, there's a tam v'das to the choice of becoming a Jew. When we say that Eid nishta vil nishta ken zayin agerisim v'alakus, is not a matter of there's a reason. It means that's your etzem. And the question is not whether you're going to do it because somebody convinced you or because it makes sense to you. It's because it's like a person connecting to who they are. And when they do that, and they connect to the bechira sa'atzmus mitzadat, bechira doesn't mean the choice between two things. Bechira means that what you choose, you're not nitfus in. You always remain beyond being defined by it. So just I'll give you an example. You have two tzaddikim. And one person comes and insults the tzaddik. And the tzaddik takes it to heart. And he has a kpeda. Another tzaddik is on a higher level, and doesn't have a kpeda, it doesn't affect him. And yet, al pi Torah, the person did something wrong. He was mevaza Talmid Chacham, he was mevaza a Rebbe, or whatever. And because of that, the Rebbe will say you have to do certain things for a tikkun, not because it affected me, because that's what the Torah demands. In other words, two different situations. One was nitfis in it, and one is not nitfis. The fact that things are chosen by us doesn't always mean it's because we're defined by it. So what Chassidus is saying is that the first level of bechira, the first two levels of bechira that we spoke about, is a bechira that makes more sense. You have two options. You could either do right or wrong. and you choose. The highest level of bechira is not a bechira between right and wrong. It's a bechira that is defined. Is it because you're defined by it, or is it because that's your etzem? And because it's your etzem, it's not imposed upon you. In other words, no one forced you to do it, no one compelled you, there's no particular reason. It's because the etzem is etzem. And when the etzem chooses something, it's not defined by its choice. So essentially it means that we become like on the level, like I said before, ka'achad mimenu, like on the level of etzem, and atzmus is not nitfus. L'ased love, we're told that will be the etzem will be bigali. We'll have both elements. We'll be human beings like we are, but we'll also be yakeli yashan miti, yashan nivra will be one with yashan miti. What does that really mean? It means we'll have an atzmizdik element to ourselves, that just like the Eibush is not nitfus and not defined by things, and not muchrich, we too will be that way. That will be our ultimate achdus, the ultimate connection. So that's ultimately, then bechira takes on a whole different meaning. It's not bechira whether you can do this or you can do that. No, you could choose good, but you're not nitfus in it. And that's already bechira because it means you're not defined by it. So when you say, someone says, I'm free to do whatever I want. Not necessarily. As long as there's some force that is imposing itself on you, whether it's a taiva or whether it's a good thing, that's not real bechira. However, when a person says, I'm doing it because that's who I am, that's the etzem of who I am, and I'm not because someone else outside is compelling me, that ultimately is the ultimate bechira. And that is shayach, obviously, only on that highest level of the etzem. This is a brief, this is a big topic, especially this last part that I just described. It's a lot more subtle, but it's a brief description of bechira and several different biurim. If there's more questions and so on, I could maybe do another share in it if necessary. It's already late, so I don't want to overextend my welcome here. But if you have questions or anything, I'll be happy to continue this discussion. But for now, let's stop here and choose well. Okay.
So is nowadays we have a real bechira because we're not, meaning most of our decisions are based on certain outside influences.
Well, the truth is, we on the external level, bechira is pretty. Look, it comes.